My brother burned my full-ride college letters to dust while my father laughed, telling me I was never worth the investment. Now, holding a Nobel Prize 15 years later, I prepared to answer their desperate calls with total annihilation. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The fever had been burning relentlessly through my veins for 3 straight days, transforming my childhood bedroom into a suffocating oven of sweat and delirium. At 18 years old, my body was succumbing to a vicious strain of pneumonia that made every breath feel as though I were inhaling shattered glass. But physical agony was nothing compared to the gnawing anxiety eating away at my mind. It was the first week of April, the most important week of my entire life. My college acceptance letters were due to arrive. I had dragged myself out of bed, my knees buckling beneath my meager weight, determined to check the heavy mahogany mail table in the grand foyer of our sterile, echoing mansion. The house was unnervingly quiet. I clung to the banister, my knuckles turning white as I descended the sweeping staircase, coughing so violently I tasted copper in the back of my throat. I expected to find the thick, glossy envelopes from Stanford, MIT, and Johns Hopkins, the physical proof that my thousands of hours of studying, my sleepless nights, and my desperate need to escape this oppressive household had finally paid off. Instead, a pungent, acrid smell drifted from the formal living room. It was the unmistakable scent of burning paper and melting wax seals. Panic, icy and sharp, pierced through the fog of my fever. I stumbled toward the arched doorway, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. What I saw in that room would forever be seared into my retinas. My older brother, Derek, who was 20 at the time and currently flunking out of his second semester at a mediocre business school, stood casually by the massive stone fireplace. In his hand, he held a heavy iron poker. At his feet lay the torn shreds of my future. I watched, paralyzed, as he nudged a thick, cream-colored envelope into the roaring flames. The crimson seal of MIT curled, blackened, and disintegrated into gray ash. "Derek!" I croaked, my voice a broken, pathetic rasp. I lunged forward, falling to my knees on the Persian rug, desperately reaching toward the grate. The heat scorched my face, but it was too late. The letters, my full-ride scholarships, the culmination of my entire existence up to that point, were gone. Derek didn't even flinch. He looked down at me with a smirk that was so devoid of empathy it chilled me to the bone. "Oops," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like you won't be needing these anymore, Mila." "What have you done?" I sobbed, the tears instantly evaporating on my fever-hot cheeks. Those were mine, my acceptances. "Calm down, drama queen," a booming, authoritative voice echoed from the doorway. I twisted around to see Carter, our father, standing there in his tailored Italian suit, swirling a glass of scotch. There was no warmth in his eyes, no paternal concern for the fact that his daughter was kneeling on the floor, weeping and gravely ill. There was only cold, calculated disdain. "Your brother and I had a long talk this morning," Carter said, stepping into the room and looking down at me as if I were an insect that had tracked mud onto his carpet. "Derek's startup ventures require significant capital, real capital. He is the future of this family's wealth. You, on the other hand, are a distraction." They were full rides. I screamed, my lungs burning in protest. "It wouldn't have cost you a single cent, Carter, not a single cent." "It's not just about the tuition, Mila," Carter replied coldly, taking a slow sip of his drink. "It's about focus. It's about the family's resources, our connections, our name. I cannot have you running off to play scientist, demanding attention and favors while Derek is trying to build a real empire. You have always been utterly useless to me. You are a drain on my energy. I told Derek to handle the mail today. You were never worth the investment." The room spun. The sheer malice of the coordinated attack took my breath away. Derek had burned my acceptances so he wouldn't have to compete with my success, and Carter had sanctioned it because his misogyny and narcissism ran so deep he truly believed I was worthless. "Get up," Carter snapped, his tone turning venomous. "I'm done looking at you. I'm done dealing with your pathetic need for validation. You think you're so smart. Let's see how smart you are on the street. You have 10 minutes to pack a single bag and get out of my house. I stared at the man who had given me half his DNA, realizing with horrifying clarity that he had never possessed a heart. The betrayal was worse than the illness burning in my lungs. The rain was coming down in freezing, torrential sheets by the time the massive wrought iron gates of Carter's estate clicked shut behind me. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching a flimsy duffel bag that contained 3 pairs of jeans, a few sweaters, and my prized biology textbooks. I had no phone, Carter had confiscated it, and exactly $42 in my wallet. My head pounded with a ferocity that made my vision blur, and every agonizing cough felt like my ribs were fracturing under the strain. I began to walk, putting one foot in front of the other, shivering so violently my teeth rattled. The physical torment of the pneumonia was entirely eclipsed by the psychological shockwave tearing through my mind. They hadn't just kicked me out, they had attempted to erase my future. Derek's smug face, illuminated by the firelight of my burning dreams, played on a continuous, agonizing loop in my head. I had spent my entire childhood trying to prove my worth to Carter. I had tutored Derek for years, written his essays, and stayed out of the way, surviving on scraps of affection that never actually materialized. After 2 miles of stumbling through the storm, my body finally gave out. I collapsed against a brick wall under the awning of a closed bakery, gasping for air, the world fading to black around the edges. I needed help. I needed someone who wouldn't look at me like I was a liability. There was only one person. Miriam. Miriam was my high school advanced biology teacher. She was a brilliant, no-nonsense woman in her late 30s who had recognized my potential when I was just a quiet 14-year-old hiding in the back of her lab. I dragged myself to a nearby corner store, begging the cashier to let me use the landline. I dialed her number from memory, my trembling fingers slipping on the plastic keys. When Miriam opened the door to her modest apartment 20 minutes later, she didn't ask questions. She saw my soaked clothes, my deathly pale face, and the blue tint to my lips, and she immediately pulled me inside. For the next week, she nursed me back from the brink, forcing fluids down my throat. Administering antibiotics, she convinced a doctor friend to prescribe off the books, and sitting by my bed while I cried until I had no tears left. On the 5th day, when my fever finally broke, I asked to use her phone. A naive, desperate part of me still believed that Carter might have changed his mind. That maybe, after realizing I was gone, a shred of paternal instinct had kicked in. I dialed his private office line. He answered on the second ring. "Carter," I whispered, my voice still incredibly weak. "It's Mila." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The quiet hum of his expensive office HVAC system was the only sound. "Who gave you this number?" he finally asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was utterly devoid of emotion, like he was speaking to a telemarketer. "Dad, please," I choked out, throwing away my pride. "I need my birth certificate. I need my social security card if I'm going to get a job. Can I just come pick them up?" "Mila," Carter said, his tone dropping an octave, becoming a lethal, quiet hiss. I made myself perfectly clear. "You do not exist in this family anymore. If you set foot on my property, I will have you arrested for trespassing. If you call this number again, I will file harassment charges. Lose the number. Lose our name." Click. The dial tone echoed in my ear like a flatline. I slowly placed the receiver back on the cradle, staring blankly at the wall. In that exact moment, the frightened, desperate 18-year-old girl died. The longing for a father's love was surgically removed from my soul, replaced by an ironclad resolve that felt heavy and permanent. I walked over to the small desk where I had placed my duffel bag. I unzipped the front pocket and pulled out my primary research notebook, running my fingers over the worn, taped cover. Carter and Derek thought they had destroyed me. They thought that by burning the paper, they had burned my potential. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. 15 years is a long time to spend entirely consumed by a singular, obsessive purpose. For 15 years, my life was measured not in birthdays, holidays, or vacations, but in microliters, clinical trials, and agonizingly long nights under the harsh fluorescent glare of university laboratories. Miriam, who eventually left high school teaching to become the dean of the Biological Sciences department at a prestigious state university, had taken me under her wing. I enrolled in community college, transferred to her university, and worked 3 excruciating minimum wage jobs to fund my own education. I gave up my 20s. I gave up dating, socializing, and sleeping. I channeled every ounce of the rage and abandonment I felt into my research on cellular regeneration and autoimmune suppression. And at 33 years old, it all paid off in a way I had never dared to actually imagine. I was sitting in my cramped, windowless office when the phone call came from Stockholm. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. My heart stopped. The world stopped. My groundbreaking work, the very science experiment my father had mocked, had successfully pioneered a treatment that would save millions of lives. Overnight, Mila became a global household name. My face was splashed across every major news network, the cover of Time magazine, and the front page of the New York Times. The exhausted, discarded teenager had become one of the most celebrated minds of the century. The ensuing weeks were a whirlwind of press conferences, university galas, and overwhelming adulation. But true to the cruel irony of the universe, the blinding light of my success inevitably illuminated the cockroaches hiding in the dark. I was sitting in the green room of a major morning talk show, sipping black coffee and reviewing my notes, when the producer nervously approached me, holding an iPad. "Dr. Mila, I'm so sorry to bother you with this," she hesitated, looking deeply uncomfortable. "But we thought you should see what's happening on Channel 5. It's about your family." I frowned, taking the tablet. I hit play on the live stream. There, sitting on a plush leather chair in a gleaming, high-rise studio, was Carter. Beside him sat Derek. The sight of them felt like a physical blow to the chest. Carter was now 60, his hair completely silver, but his arrogant posture remained identical. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that looked impossibly expensive, exuding the polished, authoritative aura of a highly successful mogul. Derek, now 35, sat beside him, mirroring his posture, attempting to look like a visionary entrepreneur. "And we couldn't be prouder," Carter was saying to the beaming interviewer, his voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, paternal warmth I had never once heard in my entire life. It was always our family's vision to support Mila's genius. When she was just 18, I recognized her potential. I made the difficult decision to push her out of the nest, to foster that incredible independence. "That must have been hard for a father," the interviewer cooed sympathetically. "Heartbreaking," Carter lied smoothly, placing a hand over his chest. "But it was necessary. Our firm, Vance Capital Holdings, quietly provided the foundational backing for her early independent studies. We knew she needed to struggle to find her true greatness. Derek and I have been cheering her on from the sidelines every step of the way." "Yeah," Derek chimed in, flashing a practiced, disingenuous smile. "Mila and I have always been so close. We're actually in talks right now to integrate her new medical patents into my latest biotech venture. Keeping it in the family, you know." I paused the video, my hand shaking so violently the coffee spilled onto my skirt. I didn't need to hire a private investigator to know why they were doing this. Over the years, I had quietly kept tabs on them through public records. Carter's real estate empire was built on a foundation of sand, leverage, and shady loans. He was currently drowning in debt, facing multiple lawsuits, and teetering on the edge of total, unrecoverable bankruptcy. Derek was even worse, a string of failed crypto scams and disastrous startups that had burned through whatever cash Carter had given him. They were desperate. They were drowning. And now, seeing my sudden, unimaginable wealth and pristine global reputation, they were trying to latch onto me like leeches. They were using my name to secure new loans, leveraging fake relationships with a Nobel laureate to save their own miserable skins. Carter was attempting to steal the credit for my life's work, portraying himself as the mastermind behind my success, while Derek was already trying to monetize my patents. They thought I was still that terrified, weeping 18-year-old girl they could easily manipulate and steamroll. They thought they could just rewrite history on national television and I would be too polite or too intimidated to correct them. My phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a transcription popped up. "Mila, it's Carter. We need to talk. We have a massive PR opportunity here. Don't ruin this. Call me back immediately." I stared at the screen, a cold, dark smile slowly spreading across my face. I wasn't the victim anymore, and I was about to teach them exactly what a miscalculated investment looked like. I listened to Carter's voicemail 3 more times. "Don't ruin this. Call me back immediately." The audacity of his command, the absolute presumption that I would heal like a well-trained dog at the first snap of his fingers, was breathtaking. But instead of the familiar, suffocating panic that used to grip my chest whenever he raised his voice, I felt a profound, icy calm settling over my mind. For 15 years, I had been the passive victim of their narrative. I had run away, hidden in laboratories, and allowed them to dictate my absence. That ended today. The turning point wasn't a sudden burst of screaming rage. It was a quiet, methodical decision to dismantle them brick by brick. Carter thought he held all the cards because he possessed the loud voice and the public platform. But he had forgotten the one crucial thing about the years I had spent trapped in his house. I had been invisible, and invisible people see everything. During my teenage years, desperate to earn my keep and avoid his wrath, I had organized his home office. I had filed his bank statements. I had cataloged his real estate holding companies. While Derek was out crashing sports cars, I was memorizing the intricate, convoluted web of Carter's offshore accounts and shell corporations. I possessed a photographic memory for numbers. I knew exactly where the foundation of his empire was weakest. The next morning, I didn't return to the television studio. Instead, I walked into the sleek, glass-paneled offices of Vanguard and Hayes, the most ruthless corporate litigation and forensic accounting firm in the city. I sat across from Marcus, a senior partner with sharp eyes and a reputation for financially eviscerating fraudulent CEOs. "Dr. Mila," Marcus said, steepling his fingers across his polished walnut desk. "It is an absolute honor. But I admit, I am surprised to see a Nobel laureate in my office asking for a forensic asset trace." "I need you to look into Vance Capital Holdings," I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the trembling hesitation of my youth. "Specifically, I need you to cross-reference their current outstanding debt with the public statements Carter made yesterday regarding his financial backing of my research. And I want to know who is keeping him afloat." Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing the blood in the water. "We can do that, but it will be expensive and it will be aggressive." "I have the resources," I replied, sliding a folded piece of paper across the desk. It contained a list of 7 obscure shell companies I remembered from 15 years ago. "Start with these. They are the arteries of his operation. Find out how much debt he is carrying, and more importantly, find out who holds the leverage." Over the next 72 hours, Marcus and his team of investigators tore into Carter's public and private filings with surgical precision. The picture they painted was far worse than I had anticipated. Carter wasn't just broke, he was running a glorified Ponzi scheme. But the most crucial piece of leverage, the clever trap I needed, came to light on the 4th day. Marcus slid a thick dossier across my desk at the university. "Your father is completely insolvent. The only thing keeping Vance Capital out of federal bankruptcy court is a recent, massive influx of private capital from his new wife, a woman named Victoria." I blinked, processing the information. He remarried. 3 years ago, Marcus confirmed, tapping the file. "Victoria is a wealthy heiress from a prominent shipping family. She is deeply in love with him, and she believes he is a financial genius experiencing a temporary, market-driven liquidity issue. She has been liquidating her personal trust to fund his operations and your brother Derek's catastrophic crypto ventures." The trap was suddenly illuminated in brilliant clarity. Carter's entire survival depended entirely on Victoria's manipulated perception of him. If she closed her checkbook, he would fall immediately. And now, he was using my name, my Nobel Prize, to convince her that his investments were sound, that he had backed a winner. Marcus, I said, a dangerous, electric thrill running down my spine. I want you to arrange a meeting. Carter, Derek, and me. Are you sure? Marcus warned gently. They are cornered animals. They will be unpredictable. I'm sure, I replied, but I have one condition for the meeting. Victoria has to be there. The private dining room at the Oak Room Country Club was suffocatingly opulent, dripping in heavy velvet curtains and the smell of aged bourbon. I arrived exactly 15 minutes late, an old power play I had watched Carter use 1,000 times. When the maitre d' opened the heavy oak doors, the three of them were already seated. Carter stood up immediately, flashing a blinding, camera-ready smile. Mila, my brilliant girl, come here, let me look at you. He moved toward me with his arms outstretched, a perfect pantomime of a loving patriarch. I didn't step back, but I raised my hand just enough to stop him dead in his tracks. Sit down, Carter. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine venom flashing in his eyes before he recovered. He slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair. Derek, sitting next to him, scoffed quietly, rolling his eyes as he scrolled through his phone. Sitting across from them was Victoria. She was an elegant woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and an expression of genuine, hopeful excitement. She looked at me as if I were a long-lost daughter. Mila, it is so wonderful to finally meet you, Victoria said, her voice warm and entirely sincere. Carter talks about you constantly. We were both just weeping with joy watching the Nobel ceremony. The sheer weight of the manipulation in the room made my skin crawl. This woman was completely spellbound, financially bleeding herself dry for a man who had never shed a tear for anyone but himself. It's a pleasure to meet you, Victoria, I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. I placed my sleek leather briefcase deliberately on the polished mahogany surface. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. Now, Carter said, clapping his hands together, his voice dripping with forced joviality. Let's talk about the future. Derek has some incredible synergistic proposals for integrating your new cellular patents into his biotech firm. The cross-promotion alone. There will be no cross-promotion, I interrupted, my voice calm but cutting through the air like a scalpel. There will be no integration, and there is no future between my research and this family. Derek finally looked up from his phone, a sneer twisting his features. Come on, Mila, don't be greedy. Dad funded your entire early career. The least you can do is let us manage the commercialization. You owe him. Ah, yes, I said softly, unlocking the brass clasps of my briefcase. The funding, the foundational backing Carter spoke so passionately about on television. I pulled out a thick, meticulously bound stack of documents and slid them directly across the table, not toward Carter, but toward Victoria. What is this? Victoria asked, confused, looking down at the heavy stack of paper. Victoria, don't look at that, Carter snapped, his tone suddenly sharp, the facade cracking. He reached out to grab the folder, but I slammed my hand down on it, staring him directly in the eyes. You will let her look, I commanded. My voice held a cold authority that made him freeze. I turned my attention back to the bewildered woman. Victoria, on television, Carter claimed his firm provided the capital for my independent studies. Inside that folder, you will find my complete financial history from the ages of 18 to 25. You will find W-2 forms from 3 separate minimum wage jobs. You will find crippling, high-interest student loan agreements. You will find eviction notices from when I had to choose between eating and buying lab supplies. Victoria slowly flipped open the cup. Her eyes scanned the first few pages, the harsh reality of my poverty starkly contrasting the billionaire narrative she had been fed. I don't understand, she whispered, her brow furrowing. Carter, you said you paid her tuition. You said you bought her laboratory equipment. She's lying, Derek barked, his voice rising in panic. She's always been a liar, Victoria. She's mentally unstable. She's just trying to humiliate us. Victoria, please, Carter said, his voice dropping into a deep, patronizing purr, the tone he used when he was trying to sound like the only reasonable person in the room. Mila has always been deeply confused about the past. She's holding onto teenage resentment. Our accountants managed those funds through blind trusts. She didn't even know where the money was coming from. Really? I asked, leaning forward, my heart pounding with a fierce, righteous adrenaline. Then why, Carter, did you and Derek physically burn my full-ride scholarship letters to MIT and Stanford in our living room fireplace? Why did you kick me out into a freezing rainstorm with $40 to my name, telling me I was never worth investing in? Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Carter, her eyes wide with shock. Carter, is that true? The reaction was immediate and desperate. Carter slammed his fists on the table, his face turning a mottled, furious red. How dare you? He roared, pointing a trembling finger at my face, abandoning all pretense of the loving father. You ungrateful, pathetic little wretch. I made you. If I hadn't thrown you out, you would have never worked hard enough to achieve anything. You owe your entire miserable existence to my discipline. I will ruin you for this. I will sue you for defamation. His poorly executed threats echoed in the dining room. He wasn't defending his actions, he was justifying the abuse. By lashing out, by revealing his true, monstrous temper in front of Victoria, he had done half my work for me. I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my jacket. You can try to sue me, Carter, but my lawyers will demand the process of discovery. We will open your books to the public, and we both know what we'll find there. I looked down at Victoria, whose hands were trembling as she stared at her husband as if seeing a stranger for the first time. Read the rest of the folder, Victoria. It gets much worse. Carter, realizing he was rapidly losing control of his narrative and his primary source of funding, went on the offensive. He launched a desperate, scorched-earth smear campaign against me. Anonymous quotes began appearing in second-tier tabloids and obscure financial blogs. They claimed Dr. Mila Vance was suffering from a mental break brought on by the stress of her sudden fame. They alleged that I was a pathological liar with a history of fabricating trauma. Derek even went on a minor podcast, playing the role of the deeply concerned brother, tearfully explaining that my delusions were tearing their family apart. It was maddening. Even with a Nobel Prize, the coordinated attack by two wealthy, established men was enough to cast a shadow of doubt over my reputation. My university chancellor called me into his office, expressing gentle, bureaucratic concern over the distracting optics. The stakes were escalating rapidly. If Carter successfully painted me as insane, Victoria might stay with him, his funding would continue, and he would survive to torment me indefinitely. Meanwhile, Victoria was fiercely struggling with her loyalty. 2 days after the restaurant meeting, she called my personal cell phone. Mila, she began, her voice tight and wavering. I read the folder. It was horrifying. But Carter says you manufactured those documents. He says you're trying to punish him for being strict. He's a proud man, Mila. He makes mistakes, his temper is terrible, but he isn't a monster. Victoria, I said gently, pacing the length of my laboratory. I know how manipulative he is. I know how deeply he can make you believe his reality. But you have to look at the facts, not his words. I've been his partner for years, she argued, the desperation evident in her tone. He's under so much pressure right now with the business. He needs me. I can't just abandon him based on a family feud from 15 years ago. She was still under his spell. The emotional abuse wasn't enough to break the bond. She needed to see the financial devastation. She needed irrefutable proof that he didn't just abuse his daughter, he was actively destroying her too. I immediately called Marcus. Where are we on the internal audit of the shell companies? I demanded, my voice tight with urgency. We struck gold, Marcus replied, his tone grim but triumphant. Or rather, we found where the gold was buried. It's exactly what you suspected, Mila, but the scale is staggering. 3 hours later, I was sitting in Marcus's office, staring at a stack of wire transfer receipts that made my blood run cold. Carter hadn't just been borrowing money from Victoria's trust. He had been actively, criminally defrauding her. He forged her signature on multiple lines of credit, Marcus explained, tracing a pen over the highlighted figures. He used a complex network of offshore LLCs to quietly drain her primary inheritance trust. And the worst part, he didn't even use the money to save Vance Capital. Where did it go? I asked, my stomach churning. He funneled over $8 million directly into Derek's failing cryptocurrency exchange, Marcus said. Derek lost it all in a matter of weeks. To cover the losses, Carter has been cooking the books of his real estate firm, essentially stealing from his own tenants to pay the interest on Victoria's drained accounts. It's a massive criminal fraud. If this goes public, he's not just facing bankruptcy. He's facing federal prison. The pieces were finally in place. The investigation had yielded the ultimate weapon. It was time for the second confrontation. I didn't call Carter. I didn't invite Derek. I sent a single, encrypted text message to Victoria, asking her to meet me privately at a neutral, quiet coffee shop across from the university campus. When she arrived, she looked exhausted, shadows bruising the skin under her eyes. She sat down tentatively, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea as if trying to draw warmth from it. "Mila, I don't know what else there is to say," she began defensively. "Carter has sworn to me that he's going to make things right with you. He just needs time." "He doesn't need time, Victoria. He needs your money to cover his crimes," I said softly. I didn't want to hurt her, but the truth was a necessary violence. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, devastatingly clear manila envelope. I laid it on the small wooden table. "I didn't ask you here to talk about my past," I told her, my voice full of quiet sorrow for the pain she was about to experience. "I asked you here because you are a victim, just like I was. Open it." Victoria hesitated, her eyes darting between my face and the envelope. With trembling fingers, she unsealed it and pulled out the forensic accounting summary. Marcus had made it simple to understand: clear graphs, highlighted wire transfers, and the undeniably forged signatures next to her real ones. I watched the color drain entirely from her face. She stared at a specific document, a transfer of $3 million from her late father's estate directly into an LLC registered to Derek Vance. "No," she whispered, a sound of pure, shattered heartbreak. "No, this is my family's trust. He told me this was locked. He told me it was safe." "He forged your signature, Victoria," I said gently, reaching across the table to place my hand over hers. "He drained your accounts to cover Derek's gambling in crypto. He is entirely bankrupt. The only reason he wanted to associate with my Nobel Prize was to use my reputation as collateral to secure a new loan to hide what he stole from you." Tears began to spill over her cheeks, dripping silently onto the glossy paper of the financial ruin laid out before her. The denial was gone. The spell, meticulously woven by Carter over 3 years of marriage, snapped cleanly in two. She wasn't looking at the man she loved anymore. She was looking at a thief who had pillaged her life. "What do I do?" she choked out, her voice trembling with a mixture of profound grief and a rapidly kindling rage. "Mila, what do I do?" I squeezed her hand, my own resolve solidifying into hardened steel. "We are going to let him dig his own grave," I told her, my eyes locking onto hers. "Next week is the university's official Nobel laureate banquet. Carter and Derek have been demanding VIP tickets to orchestrate their grand public reconciliation. We are going to give them exactly what they want." The grand ballroom of the university's primary alumni hall was a masterpiece of classic architecture, transformed for the evening into a glittering cathedral of scientific celebration. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over 50 round tables draped in heavy white linen. The air hummed with the sophisticated murmur of 500 distinguished guests, world-renowned researchers, wealthy university donors, local politicians, and a swarm of international press. This was my night, the official university Nobel laureate banquet. It was intended to be the crowning public acknowledgement of my life's work, but as I stood in the wings behind the massive velvet curtains framing the main stage, I knew it was going to be remembered for something entirely different. I peered through a small gap in the heavy fabric, my eyes scanning the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos. It didn't take long to spot them. Carter and Derek were seated at table number 3, a VIP spot located directly in front of the podium, aggressively procured by Carter through relentless phone calls to the university's development office. They were both in immaculate, custom-tailored black tie attire, holding court with a group of university trustees. Carter was laughing loudly, slapping a wealthy donor on the back, holding his champagne flute with the arrogant ease of a monarch surveying his kingdom. He was playing the role of the proud, foundational patriarch to absolute perfection. Derek sat beside him, nodding along, his eyes constantly darting toward the press pool, making sure the cameras were capturing his good side. And then, sitting quietly on Carter's left, was Victoria. She wore a simple, elegant navy gown, but her posture was rigid. She wasn't drinking. She wasn't smiling. She was staring blankly at the floral centerpiece, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Carter occasionally placed a possessive hand on her shoulder, completely oblivious to the microscopic flinch that rippled through her body every time he touched her. He thought he still had her. He thought the crisis of the coffee shop had been averted with more of his silver-tongued lies. He had no idea she and I had spent the last 4 days meticulously coordinating with Marcus and a team of federal financial regulators. Dr. Vance, a stage manager whispered, gently touching my elbow, "It's time. The chancellor is finishing his introduction." I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald green evening gown. 15 years ago, I had been a sickly, terrified teenager shivering in the rain. Today, I was a force of nature. I stepped out from behind the curtain and walked toward the podium. The applause was deafening. It rolled through the cavernous room like a physical wave, accompanied by the blinding, rapid-fire flashes of 50 different press cameras. I placed my hands on the cool mahogany of the podium and looked out over the crowd. The applause slowly died down, replaced by an expectant, electric silence. "Thank you," I began, my voice amplified by the massive sound system, echoing perfectly off the vaulted ceilings. "Thank you, Chancellor Williams, for those kind words. And thank you to the Nobel Committee, my brilliant colleagues, and my incredible mentor, Dr. Miriam Thorne, without whom none of this would be possible." I paused, letting my eyes drift down to table number 3. Carter was beaming. He puffed out his chest, leaning back in his chair, waiting for his name. He was waiting for his return on investment. "Science," I continued, my tone shifting from polite gratitude to a quiet, intense seriousness, "is fundamentally the pursuit of truth. It is the arduous process of peeling back layers of assumption, bias, and deception to reveal the undeniable reality underneath. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to look at the data, even when the data tells a story you desperately do not want to hear." The room was silent. They could tell this wasn't a standard acceptance speech. Over the past few weeks, a very specific narrative has been circulated in the press regarding the foundation of my career, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "It has been loudly claimed by a man named Carter Vance, the man who shares my DNA, that his firm, Vance Capital Holdings, provided the financial backing, the emotional support, and the necessary discipline that allowed me to stand on this stage tonight." Carter's smile widened. He actually raised his champagne glass slightly in my direction, acknowledging what he thought was an incoming compliment. Derek mirrored the gesture. "I am a scientist," I repeated, staring directly into Carter's eyes. "I do not deal in narratives, I deal in evidence. And tonight, in the spirit of truth, I am going to share the evidence of exactly what Carter Vance's support looks like." I reached under the podium and pressed a small remote. Behind me, the massive 30-foot projector screen that had previously displayed the university logo suddenly blinked to life. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Projected in towering, undeniable clarity was a high-resolution scan of my eviction, notice from a terrible apartment when I was 20. Beside it, my W-2 forms from a late-night diner. And beside that, a graph showing my crippling, unsubsidized student loan debt. 15 years ago, while I was suffering from severe pneumonia, I told the silent, captivated room. Carter and his son, Derek Vance, physically burned my full-ride college acceptances in a fireplace because they deemed me worthless. They threw me onto the street with nothing. Every single cent of my education was funded by my own grueling labor and crippling debt. Vance Capital Holdings never contributed a single dime to my existence. The color completely drained from Carter's face. The champagne glass in his hand trembled, spilling liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. Derek's mouth fell open in shock. The trustees sitting at their table physically recoiled, leaning away from them as if they were suddenly contagious. "But that is merely a family tragedy," I continued, my voice rising in power, dominating the massive room. "And while cruelty is a moral failing, it is not always a crime. What is a crime, however, is what Carter Vance did next." I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted. The audience was now looking at a complex, incredibly clear flowchart mapping the flow of millions of dollars. At the center was the forged signature of Victoria Vance, blown up to massive proportions. "To the press in the room," I said, pointing at the screen, "you are looking at the internal, forensic accounting of Vance Capital Holdings, obtained legally through the process of discovery. You are looking at proof of massive, systemic wire fraud. Carter Vance is completely insolvent. To maintain the illusion of his wealth, and to fund the catastrophic, failed business ventures of his son Derek, Carter has spent the last 3 years forging his wife's signature, illegally draining her primary inheritance trusts through offshore shell companies, and cooking his own books to cover the theft." Pandemonium erupted. Cameras began flashing wildly, not at me, but at table number 3. Reporters were scrambling for their phones, shouting questions over the din. Carter leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the floor. His face was a mask of purple, unhinged fury. "Turn that off," he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "She's insane. She forged those documents. This is defamation. I'll destroy you, Mila. I'll ruin your pathetic life." He took a step toward the stage, his fists clenched, but he was immediately blocked by 3 broad-shouldered university security guards who had been positioned nearby for exactly this reason. "You won't destroy anyone, Carter." A new, trembling, but incredibly powerful voice rang out. The room fell silent again as Victoria stood up. She didn't look at me. She turned entirely to face her husband. Her eyes were red, filled with the devastating grief of a shattered life, but her spine was perfectly straight. She held a thick manila folder in her hand. "Victoria," Carter pleaded, his tone instantly shifting from screaming rage to a sickening, panicked whine. "Victoria, darling, don't listen to her. She's crazy. You know me, you know I love you." "I know nothing about you," Victoria said, her voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the ballroom. She raised the folder. "I spent the entire afternoon with my lawyers and the FBI, Carter. They have already verified the wire transfers. They have the IP addresses you used to access my trust. You stole $8 million from my family." No, baby, it was a loan, it was a bridge loan," Carter stammered, stepping back as a security guard moved closer. "It was theft," Victoria said, her voice breaking on the word before hardening into ice. "I am filing for divorce, Carter, and the federal authorities are currently waiting for you outside the main lobby doors. You are finished." She turned away from him, refusing to look at his pathetic, crumbling facade for 1 second longer. She walked away from the table, her head held high, moving toward the exit. Derek, realizing the full extent of the disaster, panicked. "I didn't know." He shouted to the reporters, throwing his hands up in the air. "I had nothing to do with the money. He just gave it to me. I didn't know it was stolen." "You spent every dime of it, Derek," I said quietly from the podium, leaning into the microphone so the entire room heard my final judgment. "You are just as complicit, and you are just as ruined." The security guards moved in, firmly taking Carter by the arms. He fought them for a moment, screaming my name, spitting venom and threats, but it was useless. He was dragged out of the ballroom, his polished shoes scuffing against the marble, a broken, exposed fraud. Derek followed closely behind him, head down, attempting to hide his face from the blinding flashes of the press cameras. I stood at the podium and watched the heavy oak doors close behind them. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a massive, invisible weight lift off my chest. The ghosts of the terrified 18-year-old girl finally dissolved into nothingness. I turned back to the audience. The room was perfectly silent, staring at me in awe. "Now," I said, a genuine, peaceful smile finally touching my lips. "If there are no further interruptions, I believe we have some incredible medical breakthroughs to celebrate tonight." The applause that followed was not just polite or obligatory. It was a roaring, thunderous standing ovation. The aftermath of the banquet was a whirlwind of legal and media activity, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one caught in the storm. I watched it unfold from the quiet, serene safety of my laboratory, feeling entirely detached from the chaos that was consuming Carter and Derek. The evidence Marcus and his team had gathered was airtight. The FBI raid on Vance Capital Holdings occurred the morning after the banquet, capturing hard drives and physical ledgers that completely corroborated the digital trail of fraud. Carter was denied bail, deemed a significant flight risk given his offshore connections. He was indicted on 22 counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The arrogant patriarch who had once commanded rooms with a single booming word was now sitting in a federal holding cell, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his real estate empire instantly dissolved by creditors the moment his crimes became public. Derek's fate was equally pathetic, though less dramatically incarcerated. Without Carter's stolen money to prop up his lifestyle, Derek's entire world collapsed within a week. His luxury apartment was seized, his leased sports cars were repossessed, and his business partners vanished into thin air. He attempted to give several exclusive interviews claiming he was a victim of Carter's manipulation, but the public had seen him laughing at the banquet. No one was buying his sudden innocence. He was last seen moving into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, completely bankrupt and utterly unemployable, his name forever synonymous with toxic incompetence. 3 weeks after the banquet, the dust had finally begun to settle. The news cycle moved on to other scandals, and my life returned to a beautiful, focused rhythm of research and teaching. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I received a visitor at the university. Victoria walked into my office. She looked entirely different than the rigid, terrified woman at the banquet. She was dressed in comfortable linen slacks and a soft cashmere sweater. The dark circles under her eyes were fading, replaced by a weary but genuine resilience. I stood up immediately, coming around my desk to offer her a chair. "Victoria, it's so good to see you. How are you holding up?" She sat down, letting out a long, slow exhale. "It's been an education, Mila. The lawyers are untangling the mess. It turns out Carter was even worse at hiding his crimes than he was at managing his money. They anticipate I'll recover a significant portion of the trust, though it will take time." "I'm so glad," I said honestly, sitting across from her. "You didn't deserve any of this." "Neither did you," Victoria said softly, her eyes meeting mine with profound sincerity. "Mila, I want to thank you. You could have just exposed him to the press. You could have humiliated me publicly without ever warning me. But you treated me with grace. You gave me the truth when I was blind to it." "You were a victim of his manipulation, Victoria," I replied. "He is an expert at finding empathy and exploiting it. I just couldn't let him do to you what he did to me." She reached out and took my hand, giving it a firm, warm squeeze. "I am so incredibly proud to know you, Dr. Vance. The world is a better place because you refuse to let them break you." We spent the next hour drinking tea, not talking about Carter or the lawsuits, but talking about art, my research, and her plans to travel and reconnect with her own family. When she finally left, I walked her to the campus gates. We hugged, a real, lingering embrace between two survivors who had walked through the fire and emerged intact. I walked back toward the science building as the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the quad. Students were lounging on the grass, reading textbooks, their whole lives stretching out before them. I entered my lab. It was quiet, filled only with the gentle hum of the refrigerators and the rhythmic clicking of the centrifuges. I walked over to a small, secure glass display case mounted on the wall near my desk. Inside sat the Nobel Prize medal, gleaming softly under the overhead lights. I looked at the heavy gold disc, tracing the engraved profile with my eyes. For 15 years, I had been running from the memory of burning paper in a stone fireplace. I had built an entire career on the frantic energy of a girl trying to prove she had a right to exist. But looking at the medal now, the frantic energy was gone. The ghosts were dead. Carter and Derek were exactly where they belonged, trapped in the prison of their own consequences, and I was exactly where I belonged. I hadn't just survived them. I had fundamentally outgrown them. I smiled, a deep, quiet expression of total peace, and turned away from the medal. I pulled on my white coat, picked up my tablet, and walked back to my workbench. There was still so much truth left to discover.